Just before dawn, on the 24th of August, 1572, a single church bell began to ring across Paris. It was not calling people to prayer, it was a signal. Within hours, the streets of the city were running with blood, and thousands of men, women, and children lay dead in their homes and in the gutters. Historians still argue about exactly how it started, and exactly who gave the final order. But almost every version of the story leads back to the same person: a woman in her early 50s, a foreigner, a widow who dressed only in black. Her enemies called her the Serpent, the Poisoner, the Italian woman who had bewitched the throne of France. Her name was Catherine de Medici, and by the time she died, 3 of her sons had worn the crown of France. An entire dynasty had risen and collapsed around her, and she had become one of the most feared and most slandered women in European history. This is the story of how an orphaned girl from Florence, with no power, no beauty by the standards of her court, and almost no friends, came to hold a kingdom in her hands for 30 years. If you are enjoying this so far, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel more than you would think. Now, here is something I want you to imagine. Picture yourself as a young French courtier in 1533, watching a plain, frightened 14-year-old Italian girl arrive to marry into the royal family, and being told this nobody will one day rule you all. Would you have believed it? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one. To understand Catherine, you have to throw out the cartoon villain version first. The black gowns, the secret poison cabinet, the murderous schemes, all of that came later, and much of it was invented by people who hated her. The real woman was stranger and more interesting than the legend. She was clever, patient, endlessly practical, and almost impossible to shock. She survived a childhood that should have killed her, a marriage that humiliated her for years, and a country that tore itself apart along religious lines while she tried to hold it together with one hand. Over the next 90 minutes, we are going to walk through her entire life, from the plague-ridden Florence of her birth to the cold castle where she died abandoned. We will look at the famous massacre, yes, but we will also look at everything that made it possible and at the parts of her story that almost nobody tells. Let us start at the very beginning, with a baby nobody expected to survive, the orphan of Florence. Catherine was born in Florence on the 13th of April, 1519, into one of the richest and most powerful families in the world. The Medici were bankers who had made themselves the unofficial rulers of Florence and the financiers of half of Europe. They had spent more than a century turning money into influence, and influence into art, palaces, and political control. By the time Catherine was born, the family had already produced one pope, Leo X, and would soon produce another. To be born a Medici was to be born into wealth, beauty, scholarship, and danger, all tangled together. But Catherine's start in life was closer to a tragedy than a fairy tale. Her father was Lorenzo de Medici, the Duke of Urbino, the great-grandson of the most celebrated Medici of all, Lorenzo the Magnificent. Her mother was a French noblewoman, Madeleine de la Tour d'Auvergne, a relative of the French royal house, which threaded a strand of French royal blood into the baby that would matter enormously decades later. Both of her parents were dead within weeks of her birth. Her mother died about 2 weeks after the delivery, worn out and feverish. Her father followed only days after that, his body wrecked by syphilis. So before she was a month old, Catherine was an orphan, and, on paper, a duchess and an heiress, which made her a valuable object to be fought over rather than a child to be cherished. She was passed from hand to hand among relatives. Her grandmother took her in for a time and then died. An aunt named Clarice raised her after that, a strong and capable woman who gave the girl what stability she had. For much of her childhood, Catherine lived in convents in Florence, watched over by nuns who, by the standards of the age, educated her well. She learned Latin, Greek, mathematics, and the refined manners of the Italian Renaissance. Observers noted early that she was sharp, observant, and unusually composed for a child. But composure was a survival skill, because Catherine was never allowed to forget that she was a piece in other people's games. Her real protector sat far away in Rome. Her cousin, once removed, had become Pope Clement VII, and he had ambitions for the little Duchess of Florence. Then, Florence exploded. In 1527, the Medici were thrown out of the city in a revolt, and Florence declared itself a republic once more. Catherine, only 8 years old, was suddenly not a pampered heiress, but a hostage of the new government. As papal and imperial armies closed in and laid siege to the city, she lived under guard, hearing the guns, while the men in charge argued bitterly about what to do with her. Some of them wanted to hang her from the city walls in full view of the besieging army, to taunt the Medici relatives who were trying to retake Florence. Others suggested handing her over to soldiers, or shutting her in a brothel to destroy her value as a marriage prize forever. She was around 11 years old, while grown men openly debated these things within her hearing. She is said to have shaved her head and put on a nun's habit at one point, daring anyone who came for her to drag a holy sister through the streets. She survived. When the long siege finally broke and the Medici clawed their way back into power, Pope Clement had her brought safely to Rome at last. But the lessons of those years never left her. Catherine had learned, before she was a teenager, that power was the only thing that kept you alive, that allies could turn on you overnight, and that a calm face could hide almost anything. She carried all three of those lessons for the rest of her life, and she would need every one of them. The wedding that changed everything. Pope Clement VII did not rescue Catherine out of pure family feeling. He needed her. The Medici were forever hungry for legitimacy, for the kind of ancient royal blood that bankers could never simply buy. And in the King of France, Francis I, the Pope found exactly the right buyer. To understand the match, you have to understand the politics of the time. Europe was dominated by a great rivalry between France and the sprawling empire of the Habsburgs, ruled by the Emperor Charles V, who also held Spain. France and the Habsburgs fought a long series of wars over Italy and over supremacy in Europe, and the Pope was caught in the middle, courted and bullied by both. Francis I wanted an Italian alliance to strengthen his hand against the Habsburgs, and he had a spare son to trade for one. His second boy, Henry, the Duke of Orleans, was available. Catherine came with an enormous dowry, a direct connection to the papacy, and that useful thread of French ancestry. For Francis, it was a shrewd deal. For the Pope, it was a triumph that married Medici money into a royal house. For Catherine, it was, once again, a transaction in which she had no voice at all. She and Henry were both 14 years old. The wedding took place in Marseille in October 1533, and it was staged as a glittering international spectacle. Pope Clement himself made the journey and personally blessed the union, a rare honor that almost never happened for a marriage this far down a royal family. There were banquets and entertainments that ran for days, the French and the Italians each straining to outshine the other. The two teenagers were married, and by the custom of the age, the consummation of the marriage was witnessed by the king himself, who reportedly stayed to confirm that the young couple had done their duty. There was nothing private about being royal. Here is a small detail that says a great deal about her. Catherine was short, and she knew the French court would be measuring her against tall, elegant French women. So for her wedding, she reportedly wore shoes with raised heels, an Italian novelty, to give herself a few extra inches of height and presence. It is one of the earliest stories of high-heeled shoes being worn for status at a European court, and it tells you that even at 14, alone, in a strange country, Catherine was already thinking hard about how she appeared and how to control that impression. But the gift that mattered most never arrived. Within a year, Pope Clement VII was dead. The new pope had no interest in honoring the financial and political promises Clement had made, and a large part of Catherine's promised dowry, along with the territories that were supposed to come with it, simply evaporated. Overnight, the French court began to look at her differently. She was no longer the niece of a powerful pope with a fortune and an alliance behind her. She was a foreign banker's daughter, married to a prince, with a half-empty purse and a strange accent. The French began calling her the Italian woman, and they did not mean it as a compliment. Many at court felt the king had been swindled, and they let her feel it too. She was alone again, in a new country, surrounded by people who now regarded her as a bad bargain, the barren years and the other woman. For the first decade of her marriage, Catherine lived under a quiet and constant threat. She could not produce a child. In a royal marriage, this was close to a catastrophe. A princess existed, above all else, to provide heirs. Years went by, and Catherine remained childless. The whispers grew into open talk at court that the king should set her aside, annul the marriage, and find a wife who could do the one job that mattered. Catherine knew exactly how close she was to being discarded and sent back to Italy in disgrace, or shut away in a convent for the rest of her life. She was desperate. She submitted to every fertility remedy the doctors and the quacks could devise, from special diets to bizarre folk treatments, enduring humiliating examinations and useless cures, anything that might give her a child and save her position. Then the stakes rose even higher. In 1536, the king's eldest son, the Dauphin, also named Francis, suddenly fell ill and died after drinking a cup of cold water following a hard game. His Italian secretary was accused of poisoning him and was brutally executed, and dark rumors swirled, some of them later pointing the finger at the new Italians at court, including, eventually, at Catherine herself. The truth is, the young man most likely died of natural illness. But the death transformed Catherine's marriage. Her husband Henry was no longer a spare second son. He was now the Dauphin, the heir to the throne of France, and Catherine was the future queen, which meant her failure to produce an heir was no longer an embarrassment. It was a crisis of state. What saved her, more than anything, was an unexpected affection from her father-in-law. King Francis I had grown genuinely fond of the clever, eager young woman. She loved hunting, which he loved. She was curious about art, architecture, and learning, which he prized above almost everything. He refused to throw her out, even when his advisors urged him to. Catherine never forgot that kindness, but his protection could only buy her time, not safety. And while she waited and feared, another woman owned her husband completely. Her name was Diane de Poitiers. She was a French noblewoman, beautiful, cultured, and roughly 20 years older than Henry. She had become his mistress, and she was the true love and the true power in his life. Henry adored her with an intensity that bordered on worship. He wore her colors of black and white into battle and into tournaments. He showered her with jewels, lands, and titles. He even gave her one of the loveliest royal properties in France, the exquisite castle of Chenonceau. Diane, not Catherine, frequently sat at the center of the court. Diane, not Catherine, shaped many of Henry's decisions. Catherine had to endure all of this in near silence. She was the wife, Diane was the favorite, and in one of the strangest arrangements in royal history, it was reportedly Diane who pushed Henry to spend enough nights with Catherine to get her pregnant, because a barren wife who got annulled might be replaced by a young, fertile rival who could threaten Diane's own grip on the prince. So the mistress had a cold, practical interest in helping the wife conceive. Whatever the cause, the long drought finally broke. In 1544, after about 10 years of marriage, Catherine gave birth to a son, named Francis, after his grandfather. And then she did not stop. Over the next 12 years, she bore 10 children in all, 7 of whom survived infancy. She had proven herself at last. The talk of annulment died away. But the years of humiliation, of watching another woman wear her husband's heart and her family's castle, hardened something deep inside her. She had learned patience the hard way. She would wait and watch and bide her time, no matter how long it took, until the day the balance of power finally shifted. Queen in the shadows. In 1547, King Francis I died, and Catherine's husband became King Henry II of France. Catherine was now the Queen of France. On paper, she had reached the summit. In reality, she was still living in another woman's shadow. Henry's reign belonged in many ways to Diane de Poitiers. The royal mistress stood at the height of her power. She managed appointments, influenced policy, and was loaded with titles and wealth. Henry trusted her judgment more than almost anyone's. The interlinked royal emblem he used could be read as containing both his wife's initial and his mistress's, and people at court noticed and smirked. The queen got the title and bore the children. The mistress got the love and a great share of the authority. Catherine, for her part, played the long game with remarkable discipline. She did not rage. She did not openly fight Diane, which would only have embarrassed herself and angered her husband. Instead, she made herself useful, agreeable, and quietly indispensable. She acted as a gracious hostess. She bore and raised the royal children, building the next generation of the dynasty. She studied how the court actually worked, who held real power, who could be bought, who could be flattered, who was dangerous. She was assembling an education in statecraft that no university could have given her, and she was doing it without anyone treating her as a threat, which was precisely how she wanted it. Henry II's reign also hardened the religious lines that would later destroy his family. He was a devout and uncompromising Catholic, and as the Protestant Reformation spread into France, he moved to crush it. He set up a special court within the Parliament to hunt down and condemn heretics, a body so grim it became known as the burning chamber for the number of Protestants it sent to the flames. Catherine watched this too. She was not a fanatic by nature, and she seems to have absorbed a quieter lesson than her husband intended, that persecution did not make the problem go away. It only drove it underground and made it angrier. This was also the period when Catherine's lifelong fascination with the stars and the hidden world grew into something serious. She kept astrologers and seers close, men who claimed they could read the future in the movement of the planets. The most famous was a physician and prophet from the south of France, named Michel de Nostradame, known today as Nostradamus. She also relied for years on an Italian astrologer named Cosimo Ruggieri, who became one of her most trusted advisors. Catherine took their predictions seriously and consulted them before major decisions throughout her life. To her enemies, this interest in astrology and the occult would later become proof that she trafficked with dark and demonic forces. To Catherine herself, it was simply another instrument for trying to master an uncertain world, the very same impulse that drove her politics. She was nearly 40 years old. She had survived an orphaned childhood, a hostile court, a barren decade, and years of standing patiently behind her husband's mistress. She had no obvious path to real power and no reason to expect one. And then, in the summer of 1559, fate handed her everything in the space of 10 agonizing days. The prophecy and the lance. The summer of 1559 was meant to be a season of celebration. France had just signed a major peace treaty with Spain, ending a long and ruinous phase of the wars between the two powers. To seal the new friendship, 2 royal marriages were arranged. Henry's daughter Elizabeth was to marry the powerful King Philip II of Spain, and Henry's sister was to marry the Duke of Savoy. Paris filled with festivities, and the centerpiece was a grand tournament. a series of jousts in which knights in armor charged at one another on horseback with lances. King Henry II, athletic, vain, and proud of his own prowess, insisted on competing in person. According to the famous legend, Catherine had been warned. Nostradamus had published a cryptic verse a few years earlier that spoke of a young lion overcoming an old one on the field of combat, of 2 wounds in one, and of a cruel death. Whether or not Catherine genuinely connected that riddle to her husband in advance, she is said to have had a dark, sleepless dread about the tournament and to have begged Henry not to take part. Henry, confident and unworried, brushed her aside. On the 30th of June, Henry rode against a young captain of his Scottish Guard named Gabriel de Montgomery. The 2 men charged down the lists. Their lances struck, and then Montgomery's lance shattered against the king's armor. He had failed to throw away the broken stub in time, and a long splinter of wood drove up under Henry's visor, pierced his eye, and entered his brain. He did not die at once. He lingered for 10 days in agony, while the finest physicians in Europe, including the celebrated surgeon Ambroise Paré, tried and failed to save him. They are said to have experimented on the severed heads of condemned criminals to understand the wound, to no avail. On the 10th of July, 1559, King Henry II of France died. He was 40 years old, killed in a game during a celebration of peace. For Catherine, this was the hinge on which her entire life turned. In an instant she went from the overlooked wife to the widowed mother of the new king, and she moved with cold, immediate purpose. One of her very first acts was to demand that Diane de Poitiers surrender the crown jewels she had been given and return the castle of Chenonceau, Henry's great love gift, to his mistress. Diane, stripped of the royal protector who had shielded her for decades, had no power left to resist. Catherine took Chenonceau for herself. After more than 20 years of swallowed humiliation, the queen had finally won the long, silent war with the mistress, on the very day her rival's power died with the king. And from that day forward, Catherine dressed almost entirely in black. This was a deliberate and unusual choice. White, not black, was the traditional color of royal mourning for French queens. Catherine chose black instead, and she kept wearing it for the rest of her life, for 30 more years. She took as her personal emblem a broken lance, the very weapon that had killed her husband, with a motto of tears and sorrow. The widow in black had been created in a single stroke. The Black Queen had arrived, and the kingdom was about to learn what she was capable of. The boy king and the Guise family. The new king was Catherine's eldest son, Francis II. He was 15 years old, sickly, timid, and entirely unready to rule. And he was already married to one of the most famous women of the century, Mary, Queen of Scots. This marriage created Catherine's first great problem as a royal mother. Mary was charming, beautiful, and strong-willed, but more importantly, she was the niece of 2 of the most ambitious men in France. They were the Duke of Guise, a brilliant and ruthless soldier, and his brother, the Cardinal of Lorraine, a cunning churchman and politician. The Guise family were fierce, militant Catholics, and they saw the marriage of their niece to the young king as the moment to seize control of the whole kingdom. With a frail teenage king who leaned on his wife, and a wife who leaned on her Guise uncles, the Guises effectively ran France. This shoved Catherine, the king's own mother, toward the sidelines, just as she had finally tasted real influence. But it also threw the great noble families of France into bitter competition, because the Guises were not the only ambitious house at court. They were rivaled by the ancient and powerful Montmorency family, led by the old soldier Anne de Montmorency, and above all by the Bourbon princes, who were princes of the blood standing close to the throne. Many of these Bourbon and other noble rivals of the Guises were also drawn toward the new Protestant faith, which tangled the political feud and the religious quarrel into a single, explosive knot. Catherine did not panic and did not pick a fight she could not win. She watched, she waited, and she began positioning herself as the one steady figure who might balance these warring camps. France badly needed balancing, because the religious split was widening into a chasm. The Protestant Reformation had spread deep into the kingdom, and a growing number of French people, including many powerful nobles, had converted to a strict, disciplined form of Protestantism. In France, they were called Huguenots. The Catholic majority, led by hardliners like the Guises, regarded them as heretics and traitors who threatened the soul of the nation. The Huguenots regarded the Catholic establishment as corrupt and tyrannical. The hatred between them was real, deep, and increasingly armed. In 1560, a group of Huguenot nobles hatched a plot to seize the young king and pull him out of Guise control. The plan was discovered before it could succeed, and the Guises crushed it with horrifying brutality. Hundreds of conspirators were rounded up and executed, many of them hanged from the walls and battlements of the royal castle of Amboise, their bodies left dangling and rotting in public view as a warning. The court watched. Catherine's young children watched. It was a vivid and bloody lesson in just how savage the religious conflict was about to become. In the aftermath, the Guises even put one of the leading Bourbon princes, the Prince of Condé, on trial and condemned him to death for his suspected role. And then, at the very end of that year, everything changed again. The sickly young king collapsed. Francis II developed an abscess in his ear that spread, and in December 1560, he died. He had reigned for barely 17 months. His death came just in time to save the condemned Prince of Condé from the executioner. His Scottish widow, Mary, eventually returned to Scotland and her own famous and tragic story. And the throne of France passed to Catherine's next son in line, a boy of 10. This time, Catherine was ready. The regent seizes power. The new king, Charles IX, was a child of 10. A child cannot rule. Someone had to govern in his name. And this time, Catherine made absolutely certain that someone was herself. She moved with speed and total decision. By rights, the regency might have gone to the senior Bourbon prince, Antoine of Navarre, the first prince of the blood. But Catherine outmaneuvered everyone. She struck deals, she dangled offices, and she had her young son confirm her as governor of France, holding supreme authority in his name. She effectively neutralized her rivals by giving them titles that flattered them without handing them control. After a lifetime of being overlooked, dismissed, and outmaneuvered by others, Catherine de Medici had become the most powerful person in France, and she was about to discover just how poisoned the cup she had seized really was. The country she now governed was a powder keg. Catholics and Huguenots were arming themselves across the kingdom. Great noble families were lining up on opposite sides of the religious divide, each with private armies, ancient grudges, and foreign backers. Whole regions leaned Protestant, while others were fiercely Catholic. Any spark could set the whole country ablaze. Catherine's instinct, and this is essential to understanding her, was not to crush one side or the other. She was not a religious fanatic. By temperament and by hard experience, she was a pragmatist who cared about stability far more than doctrine. What she wanted, above everything, was a peaceful France, with her sons securely on the throne. She believed the path there was compromise, and she set out to lift the monarchy above the religious quarrel, holding the two sides apart and forcing them to coexist under royal authority. To help her, she appointed a moderate and humane chancellor named Michel de l'Hôpital, a man who shared her belief that the kingdom could survive only through tolerance and law rather than slaughter. In 1561, she organized a great religious conference, gathering Catholic and Protestant theologians in the same room to argue out their differences and search for common ground. It was a remarkable, almost startling act of optimism for the age, and it failed. The two sides were simply too far apart on the deepest questions of faith. Undaunted, in early 1562, Catherine pushed through a royal edict that, for the first time, granted French Huguenots limited legal rights to gather and worship outside the towns. It was a genuine, bold attempt at toleration, decades ahead of its time and far ahead of what most of Europe could imagine. It lasted only weeks. The Catholic hardliners were enraged that heretics had been granted any rights at all. And out in the countryside, the fragile peace was about to be shattered by a single, terrible act of violence that would plunge France into a generation of war. The wars of religion began. In March 1562, the Duke of Guise was traveling through a small town called Vassy in eastern France. There, his armed followers came upon a large congregation of Huguenots worshipping inside a barn. Words turned to insults, insults turned to stones, and then the Duke's men drew their weapons and fell on the unarmed worshippers. Dozens of Protestants were slaughtered, men, women, and children, and many more were left wounded and bleeding. The massacre at Vassy lit the fuse. Outraged Huguenots across France took up arms under the leadership of the Prince of Condé and the respected Admiral Gaspard de Coligny. The Catholics rallied behind a powerful alliance of the Duke of Guise, the old soldier Montmorency, and another great noble, a grouping often called the Triumvirate. France collapsed into open civil war. This was the first of what would become a long, grinding series of conflicts known as the French Wars of Religion, which would tear the country apart, on and off, for more than 30 years. Catherine de Medici would spend the rest of her life trapped in the middle of them. The First War was vicious and inconclusive, and it claimed leaders on both sides. In 1563, the Duke of Guise himself was shot in the back and killed by a Protestant assassin while besieging a Huguenot-held city. His family was convinced that Coligny had ordered the killing, an accusation the admiral always denied. That belief planted a seed of personal hatred between the Guise family and Coligny that would, 9 years later, help trigger the greatest bloodletting of all. With the leaders exhausted and the war stalemated, Catherine seized the moment to broker a peace, the first of many she would negotiate, granting the Huguenots limited rights once again in exchange for laying down their arms. Catherine's strategy through these wars was consistent, even when it looked like the opposite. She tried to keep either side from winning a total victory. A complete Catholic triumph would make the Guises too powerful and threaten her own family's control of the crown. A complete Huguenot triumph would shatter the Catholic foundation of the monarchy and the loyalty of most of the kingdom. So Catherine maneuvered endlessly. She negotiated, she bought time, she switched her approach depending on who was winning, and she made peace deals that satisfied no one and held only until the next outrage reignited the fighting. To her critics, then and now, this looked like cynicism, even treachery. A woman with no principles playing both sides against each other. To her defenders, it was the only rational policy available to someone trying to hold a fracturing kingdom together for her children. The truth is probably that Catherine genuinely did not care very much which version of Christianity prevailed. What she cared about was the crown, the family, and survival. Religion, to her, was a problem to be managed, not a cause worth dying for. In an age of burning conviction on both sides, that cool detachment made her almost impossible for her contemporaries to understand, and it made her very easy to hate. Here is something most people do not know. Even while the wars raged, Catherine launched one of the most ambitious political journeys in French history. Between 1564 and 1566, she took her young son, Charles IX, on an enormous tour of the entire kingdom. The royal court, thousands of people, with wagons, horses, baggage, and servants, traveled across France for more than 2 years so that the people could see their king in the flesh and feel loyalty to the crown rather than to a religious faction. The grand tour ended near the Spanish border at Bayonne, where Catherine met with envoys of the Spanish king. Some Protestants later claimed, almost certainly wrongly, that a plot to exterminate the Huguenots was hatched at that meeting. In truth, it was Catherine governing the only way she truly knew how, by managing perception and personal relationships, town after town, mile after mile. The court of the Black Queen. To understand Catherine, you have to step inside the world she built, because the French royal court under her influence became one of the most spectacular and most talked about places in all of Europe. Catherine brought Italy with her. She had grown up amid the art and refinement of Renaissance Florence, and she poured that sensibility into the French court like dye into water. She was a passionate and tireless builder. She extended the great royal palace of the Louvre, began the enormous new Tuileries Palace in Paris, built herself a grand townhouse in the city, and lavished attention on her beloved Chenonceau, the castle she had taken from Diane de Poitiers, where she added a magnificent gallery across the river and threw legendary festivities. She loved festivals, banquets, and elaborate entertainments she called her magnificences, and she used them as instruments of statecraft, dazzling rivals and foreign visitors with the wealth, beauty, and sophistication of the French monarchy. Let me paint you a picture of the world inside that court, because the gap between the top and the bottom of French society in this era was staggering. At the summit sat the king, the queen mother, and the high nobility, and their lives were a continuous performance of luxury. Noble women wore stiff gowns of silk and velvet, stretched over rigid frameworks that sculpted the body into the fashionable shape, with high starched collars called ruffs framing the face, and jewels sewn directly into the cloth. Men wore padded doublets, close-fitting hose, short cloaks, and feathered caps, and a gentleman of rank was never seen without his sword. The court dined in stages, course after course of roasted meats, game birds, rich spiced sauces, sugared confections, and increasingly, the refined Italian dishes and elegant table manners that Catherine encouraged. Daily life at this height was ruled by intricate etiquette: who entered a room first, who was permitted to sit, who could speak, and when. Far below all of this, the vast majority of French people were peasants who worked the land, ate coarse dark bread, vegetables, and very little meat, wore rough wool, and could be thrown into starvation by a single failed harvest. And cutting straight through every level of this society, from the gilded palace to the poorest village, ran the religious divide that was tearing it all apart. A peasant and a duke might agree on nothing else in the world, but each had chosen a side in the war between Catholic and Huguenot. Catherine also developed a famous and infamous instrument of statecraft. She surrounded herself with a circle of beautiful, intelligent, well-born young women who served as her ladies-in-waiting. According to legend, she deployed them deliberately to charm, seduce, and gather secrets from powerful men, using their influence to soften enemies and extract information that armies never could. They became known as her flying squadron. How systematically Catherine truly used these women as agents is debated by historians, and the stories grew taller with every retelling. But there is no doubt that she understood that information and personal charm were as valuable as cannon, and she ran her court accordingly. And here is one of the great myths worth puncturing. You will often hear that Catherine de Medici single-handedly brought fine cuisine to France, introducing the fork, ice cream, and a long list of Italian dishes when she arrived as a teenage bride. It is a charming story, and it is mostly false. Many of those innovations appeared in France well before or well after her time, and food historians have steadily dismantled the idea that one homesick Italian girl civilized French cooking, but the myth endures precisely because it captures something true about her. Catherine genuinely did bring Italian art, taste, and theatricality to the French court, including a love of elaborate spectacle and early forms of ballet, one of which she staged on a scale never seen before. The legend grew, as legends do, in the soil of a real influence. Her appetite for spectacle reached its peak in 1581, when she staged an entertainment for a royal wedding that historians often point to as a foundational moment in the history of ballet. It wove together dance, music, poetry, and elaborate moving scenery into a single unified performance that ran for hours and astonished every ambassador who saw it. It was political theater in the most literal sense, a demonstration to all of Europe that the French crown, whatever its troubles at home, could still command beauty, order, and wealth on a scale no rival could match. Catherine understood that a kingdom torn by war needed to be reminded, now and then, of its own magnificence, and that the spectacle of power could be a kind of power in itself. The gathering storm. The peace Catherine kept negotiating never held for long. Across the 1560s, France lurched through a second and then a third war of religion, each one flaring up over some fresh outrage, each one ending in another fragile settlement that satisfied nobody. The Third War was especially bloody. At the Battle of Jarnac in 1569, the royal army shattered the Huguenot forces, and the Prince of Condé was captured and then shot dead in cold blood, which only hardened Protestant resolve and pushed Admiral Coligny into sole command of their cause. The Huguenots, well organized and increasingly militant, fought the crown to a standstill again and again, and when the Third War finally ended in 1570 with the Peace of Saint-Germain, the settlement Catherine brokered was strikingly generous. It granted the Protestants not only freedom of worship in many areas, but also control of several fortified towns they could garrison and defend, including the great Atlantic port of La Rochelle. It was the high watermark of Catherine's long policy of compromise. By this point, she had been steering France through nearly a decade of intermittent civil war, and she was worn down by the endless cycle of killing and bargaining. She wanted, desperately, a settlement that would actually last, and she thought she had finally found the way to get one. Her plan was a marriage. Catherine's daughter, Marguerite, often called Margot, was a Catholic princess of France, beautiful and famous across Europe. Catherine arranged to marry her to Henry of Navarre, a young prince who was the leading figure of the Protestant Huguenots and who stood close to the line of succession to the French throne himself. The idea was bold and, in theory, brilliant. A grand wedding uniting the Catholic royal family with the Protestant Huguenot leadership would symbolize reconciliation to the whole kingdom. It would bind the two warring camps together through the strongest tie of all, a royal family bond. It might, at long last, bring peace. There was a dark shadow over even this hopeful plan, and it points straight to Catherine's growing reputation. Henry of Navarre's mother was Jeanne d'Albret, the formidable Protestant Queen of Navarre, who came to court to negotiate the marriage of her son and then, in June 1572, suddenly sickened and died. She most likely died of natural illness, perhaps tuberculosis. But almost at once, a rumor spread that Catherine had murdered her with a pair of poisoned gloves, a present laced with venom that killed her through the skin. There was no real evidence for it. Yet the very fact that people instantly believed Catherine capable of such a thing tells you exactly what her reputation had become by this point. The poisoner in black was already a figure of terror in the popular imagination. The wedding went ahead anyway, set for August 1572 in Paris. Huguenot nobles from every corner of France streamed into the heavily Catholic capital to celebrate the union of their leader with the king's own sister. Paris, fiercely and proudly Catholic, filled up with thousands of armed Protestants in a mood of nervous triumph, and the tension in the crowded streets grew suffocating. The ordinary Catholics of the city seethed at the sight of so many heretics celebrating, as they saw it, the pollution of the royal bloodline by marriage. At the same time, Catherine had a new and intensely personal worry. Admiral Coligny, The very man the Guises blamed for the murder of their duke years earlier had now gained real and growing influence over her son, King Charles IX. Coligny was respected, principled, fatherly, and persuasive, and he was steering the young king toward a dangerous policy. He wanted France to go to war against mighty Catholic Spain in support of the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. Catherine saw nothing but ruin in this. A war with Spain could destroy France, and worse, in her eyes, another man had won a hold over her son and was pulling him away from her own guidance. She had spent her whole life making certain that no one came between her and the control of her children. Coligny had to be removed from the king's side, one way or another. What happened next would define Catherine de Medici forever. The St. Bartholomew's Day Massacre. 4 days after the wedding, on the 22nd of August, 1572, someone fired a shot at Admiral Coligny in the streets of Paris. The bullet struck him, shattering his hand and wounding his arm, but it did not kill him. He survived, badly hurt, carried to his lodging where the king himself came to visit and promised justice. The attempt on Coligny's life threw Paris into chaos. The Huguenot nobles in the city were enraged and frightened, and they demanded that the king find and punish whoever was responsible. They suspected, correctly, that the plot had reached down from the highest levels of the court, and there is strong reason to believe Catherine and the Guises were behind it, having tried to remove Coligny quietly and failed. Now the failure left them dangerously exposed. The young and emotionally fragile King Charles IX was shaken and furious. And the city, packed with thousands of armed and grieving Protestants on one side, and a seething, terrified Catholic population on the other, teetered on the very edge of explosion. In the royal palace, a tense and secret meeting took place. We do not know precisely what was said, because everyone in that room had powerful reasons to lie about it afterward, but the outcome is clear enough. Catherine, several royal counselors, and ultimately the king himself made a fateful decision. Rather than wait for a Huguenot uprising over the botched assassination, they would strike first. They would kill Coligny and the other leading Huguenot nobles gathered in Paris, all at once, in a single decisive blow, and decapitate the Protestant movement before it could move against them. Many historians believe Catherine was the driving force who worked on her terrified son through the night until he broke and authorized the killings, reportedly crying out that then they should kill them all so that none would be left alive to reproach him. The killing began in the early hours of the 24th of August, the feast day of St. Bartholomew. Royal soldiers went first for Coligny. They broke into his lodging, stabbed the wounded admiral, and threw his body from the window into the street below. Then the signal bells rang out across the city, and what had been planned as a targeted strike against a few dozen Huguenot leaders spiraled, almost instantly, into something far larger and far more terrible. The Catholic population of Paris, primed by years of hatred, fear, and inflammatory preaching, took the killing of the Protestant leaders as permission to murder every heretic they could find. Armed mobs poured into the streets. They broke into homes. They killed Huguenot men, women, and children, dragged bodies through the streets, looted the houses of the dead, and threw corpses into the river until it was said to run red. The violence raged in Paris for days and then spread outward across France, where local Catholics in city after city carried out their own massacres of their Protestant neighbors over the following weeks. By the time the slaughter finally burned itself out, the death toll across the kingdom ran into the thousands. Estimates vary widely, but many historians place the total dead at somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000 people, and some go considerably higher. The St. Bartholomew's Day massacre sent a shockwave across Europe. In Protestant countries, it was received with horror as the ultimate proof of Catholic treachery and savagery. In Catholic Rome, appallingly, the news was celebrated. The Pope ordered bells rung and a special medal struck to commemorate it. The young Henry of Navarre, The Protestant groom at the center of it all saved his own life only by agreeing on the spot to convert to Catholicism, a conversion he would later renounce. And from that day to this, Catherine de Medici has carried the blame as the massacre's principal architect. The exact truth of who decided what, and how far the spiraling slaughter was intended versus how far it spun wildly out of anyone's control, is still debated by historians. But there is little serious doubt that Catherine helped set in motion the targeted killings that opened the floodgates. It is the single act for which she is most remembered, and it sealed her reputation as the dark, murderous queen for all time. The breaking of Charles. The massacre did not bring the peace Catherine had gambled everything to win. It did the opposite. It poured oil on the fire, deepened Huguenot hatred and distrust beyond any hope of repair, and guaranteed that the wars of religion would grind on for another generation. A fourth war broke out almost at once, and a great Huguenot stronghold on the coast, the city of La Rochelle, rose in defiance and withstood a long and bloody royal siege, and the massacre broke the king. Charles IX had always been an unstable young man, prone to violent swings of mood and bursts of rage. He had been pushed and pulled for years between his domineering mother and his fatherly Huguenot advisor, and in the end, worn down in that single terrible night, he had given the order that unleashed the slaughter. Afterward, according to those around him, he was tormented by what he had done. He suffered guilt, nightmares, and fits, and reportedly raved that he saw the bloody bodies of the murdered everywhere he looked. His health, never strong, collapsed under the strain. Whether his decline was driven by remorse, by the tuberculosis that was eating his lungs, or by both together, the king faded with terrible speed. In May 1574, less than 2 years after the massacre, Charles IX died. He was only 23 years old. With his death, Catherine lost the second of her sons to wear the crown, and the throne now passed to the son who was, by every account, her clear and undisguised favorite. That son was Henry, the Duke of Anjou, who would reign as Henry III. There was just one large complication. Henry was not in France. Through Catherine's own scheming and diplomacy, he had recently been elected to a very different throne. He had become the King of Poland, far away in the east, ruling a foreign and fractious kingdom that had chosen him only months before. When the news of his brother's death reached him, Henry made a dramatic choice. He abandoned Poland entirely. He slipped away from his Polish court in secret, reportedly fleeing on horseback in the night with the Polish nobles in furious pursuit, and made his way back across Europe, lingering in Italy along the way, to claim the far greater prize of the French crown. After all her losses, Catherine had at last gotten her favorite son onto the throne of France. The favorite son and the 3 Henrys. With Henry III on the throne, you might expect Catherine to finally loosen her grip. She had her favorite child ruling, a son who genuinely loved and respected her and relied on her counsel. But the kingdom Henry inherited was, if anything, more broken than the one his brothers had ruled, and the years ahead would be a long, slow erosion of everything Catherine had fought her whole life to hold together. Henry III was the most intelligent and cultured of all her sons, refined, eloquent, and politically shrewd, but he was also moody, exhausting, and increasingly withdrawn. He surrounded himself with a circle of pampered, extravagant young male favorites, nicknamed his darlings, who scandalized the court and were widely resented by the old nobility. He swung between bouts of intense, almost frantic religious devotion, walking in penitential processions and stretches of lavish indulgence. In the early years, he leaned heavily on his mother, and Catherine remained one of the most active and tireless figures in the kingdom, constantly traveling, negotiating, and trying to broker peace between the factions even as she aged and her health declined. Through all of this, Catherine never stopped playing the great game of dynastic marriage, the same tool that had been used to arrange her own wedding decades earlier. She had spent her career marrying her children into the royal houses of Europe to build alliances and extend her family's reach. Her daughter Elizabeth, married years before to King Philip II of Spain, had become Queen of Spain and then died young, a loss that struck Catherine hard. Another daughter, Claude, had been married into the powerful ducal house of Lorraine, and in her later years Catherine pursued one of the most remarkable matches of all. She tried for years to marry her youngest son, the Duke of Alencon, to Queen Elizabeth I of England, a Protestant queen who was his senior by decades. The strange, drawn-out courtship between the small French prince and the English queen, who reportedly nicknamed him her frog, became one of the great diplomatic spectacles of the age before it finally collapsed. For Catherine, a wedding was never simply a wedding. It was always a move on the board, but the ground was shifting beneath her, and in 1584 it gave way entirely. Catherine's youngest son, Francis, the Duke of Anjou and Alencon, died. He had been a restless, scheming, troublesome prince who had plotted against his own brother more than once. But as long as he lived, he was the heir to the throne, because Henry III had no children of his own and never would. With the youngest son dead and the king childless, the line of Catholic Valois heirs was finished. And that meant the next man in line for the throne of France was now Henry of Navarre, the Protestant prince, the survivor of the massacre, the husband of Catherine's daughter. For the militant Catholics of France, the prospect of a Protestant king was the ultimate nightmare, and it drove them to fury. So the religious wars mutated into their final and most dangerous form, a three-way struggle that historians call the War of the Three Henrys. On one side stood Catherine's son, King Henry III, trying to hold the center and the crown. On the second stood Henry, the Duke of Guise, the charismatic and ruthless leader of an aggressive new Catholic alliance called the Catholic League, which was determined to crush the Protestants entirely, to bar Navarre from the throne, and which increasingly defied the king himself with the backing of Spain. On the third stood Henry of Navarre, the Protestant heir, fighting for his life and his crown. Catherine spent her final years trying, with diminishing success, to manage this impossible three-sided conflict. Traveling the country well into her 60s to meet with rebels and rivals, calling in every favor, and spending every ounce of the political skill she had sharpened over half a century. But the factions had grown too powerful and too fanatical for even her to control. The Catholic League, led by the Duke of Guise, grew so strong that it could face down the king to his face. In 1588, Paris itself rose against Henry III, and the humiliated king was driven out of his own capital by the supporters of the Duke of Guise, in an uprising remembered as the day the barricades went up in the streets. Here is a final small detail that captures the strange, watchful nature of the woman. Among the buildings Catherine commissioned in Paris was a tall, freestanding column attached to her townhouse, with a spiral staircase winding up inside to a platform at the very top. It is widely believed she had it built so that her astrologers could climb up and observe the stars and read the heavens on her behalf. The column still stands in Paris today, hard against a later building, a quiet stone monument to a queen who spent her entire life trying to read the future and bend it to her will. The death of the Black Queen. By December 1588, Catherine de Medici was old, gravely ill, and very nearly out of moves. The king had summoned a great assembly of the realm to the royal castle of Blois, hoping to recover some authority. But the Duke of Guise and the Catholic League dominated it completely and humiliated him at every turn. And then her favorite son did something that horrified her and shattered the last of her careful balancing. Henry III, cornered, humiliated, and convinced that the Duke of Guise meant to take his throne, decided to destroy his rival once and for all. He invited the Duke to a private meeting in the royal apartments at Blois. There, on the morning of the 23rd of December, Henry had his guards fall upon the Duke of Guise and stab him to death. And the next day, he had the Duke's brother, the Cardinal of Guise, killed as well, striking down the two leaders of the Catholic League in cold blood inside the king's own castle. When Catherine learned what her son had done, she was reportedly devastated, and not out of sympathy for the Guises, but out of a clear, cold understanding of what was coming. She grasped at once what Henry had failed to see, that killing the Duke of Guise would not break the Catholic League, but would enrage it, turning the powerful Catholic faction and much of the country into open rebellion against the king and plunging France into even deeper chaos. She is said to have warned her son that he had cut well, but now he must be able to sew, and she doubted he had the strength to stitch the kingdom back together. She was right. Catherine did not live to see the consequences play out. She was already mortally ill, worn down by decades of ceaseless travel, stress, and grief, her body failing in the cold castle. On the 5th of January, 1589, just 2 weeks after the murders at Blois, Catherine de Medici died in that same castle. She was 69 years old. After a life spent at the very center of French power, scheming, building, negotiating, and surviving, she died in a kingdom collapsing around her, with her favorite son having brushed aside her final, desperate warning. Even her burial was tangled in the chaos she left behind. Because Paris was in open revolt and controlled by her son's enemies in the Catholic League, her body could not be safely carried to the capital for the grand royal funeral she had planned. She was buried quietly and almost without ceremony at Blois, far from the magnificent tomb she had built for herself in Paris beside her husband. Only many years later were her remains finally moved to rest among the kings and queens of France. And the fall she had predicted came swiftly. Within 8 months of Catherine's death, her son Henry III was assassinated. A fanatical young friar, burning with rage over the murder of the Catholic leaders at Blois, gained access to the king on the pretext of carrying a message and drove a knife into his belly. With Henry's death, the royal line that Catherine had spent her entire life protecting came to an end. The Valois dynasty was finished. Every single one of the sons she had fought, schemed, married off, and waited for had now died, and not one of them had left a son to follow him. The crown passed, exactly as the Catholic League had dreaded, to her Protestant son-in-law, Henry of Navarre, who eventually accepted the Catholic faith to win over his kingdom and reigned as King Henry IV, founding an entirely new ruling house. Everything Catherine had built her life around outlasted her by less than a year before it crumbled into dust. Legacy. So, who was Catherine de Medici, really? For centuries, the answer seemed simple. She was the Black Queen, the Italian poisoner, the cold mastermind behind the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre, a woman who killed without conscience to keep her sons on the throne. That image was shaped largely by her enemies, especially Protestant writers who had every reason to turn her into a monster, and it has clung to her ever since, through plays, novels, and films, right down to the present day. The real Catherine was more complicated than the legend, and in some ways more impressive, even if no less troubling. She was not a fanatic. She did not hate Protestants on principle, and for years she genuinely pursued policies of toleration and compromise that were far ahead of their time, employing a moderate chancellor and pushing edicts of toleration through a hostile court when almost no one else in power in Europe would have dared. She was one of the most capable political operators of the entire 16th century, a foreign orphan with no natural power base who clawed her way to the summit of a hostile kingdom and then held it together, against impossible odds, through the reigns of 3 of her sons. She was a great patron of art and architecture, whose palaces and gardens still shape the city of Paris. And she was also, almost certainly, deeply complicit in a massacre that killed thousands of innocent people, a pragmatist whose cold willingness to do whatever it took to protect her family led directly to one of the great atrocities of the age. She was not the cartoon villain of the legend, but she was not innocent either. She was something harder to hold in the mind, a survivor who had learned, as a hostage child in a besieged and starving city, that power was the only thing that kept you alive, and who then spent 50 years acting on that lesson without flinching from what it cost. Whether you see her as a ruthless killer, a grieving mother, a brilliant stateswoman, or all three of those things at the very same time, may say as much about you as it does about her. And that very ambiguity is exactly why, more than 400 years after her death, we are still standing here arguing about the woman in black. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, you now understand Catherine de Medici better than almost anyone who only knows her from the massacre. There is another video waiting for you on screen right now, and that one is next. If this was worth the time, a quick subscribe tells me to keep making history this deep. Thanks for watching.